on Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1. Streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
You're listening to The Jan Price Show, and my guest today is Tao Ruspoli, who we're going to be talking about his brand new documentary called Monogamish. What a great title. How did you come up with that title?
Well, the word monogamish was coined by the great Dan Savage, who I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. He's a sex advice columnist who was started out in the early 90s. I started reading him in the alternative weeklies when I was in college at Berkeley. And he was very edgy back then. He's a gay advice columnist. The column was born as a joke almost, because he said, I don't know how to give advice to straight couples. And then his friend who started The Stranger, which was the weekly in Seattle, said, well, why don't you do the advice column and treat straight couples with the same ignorance and contempt that straight advice columnists usually reserve for gay couples, right? But now the culture has kind of come towards him, and he's come towards the culture, and now Dan Savage is nationally recognized, syndicated all over the country. Written several books. He's been in the New York Times. He's been on Bill Maher. He's he's a nationally recognized figure, and he's coined the word monogamish as a kind of advice to people to maybe we should recognize that we're not 100% monogamous, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up so much, and maybe we should build our relationships accordingly.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the movie, just to give our listeners a little a background about what the movie's about. Can you encapsulate it for us?
Yeah, so I was married for almost 10 years and then got divorced, much to my heartbreak and surprise.
And you were married to Olivia Wilde?
Yes, but that's incidental.
Okay.
So as I was getting divorced, I met this amazing old woman who lived next door to me down the alley. Her name was Roberta Hayes. And I used to go over to her house and kind of have breakfast, and she'd give me relationship advice. And I realized she was such a compelling character that it would be fun to make a short film about her, which I did. And it was a 10-minute short, and it got a lot of rave reviews on YouTube, and my friend and mentor Oliver Stone saw it and was very encouraging and said, this is fantastic. And suddenly I realized maybe I could make a longer film and a longer exploration of relationships. And I was a bit of a snob about it at first. In my head, I was like, maybe it's too mushy of a subject, not like intellectually rigorous enough. But I quickly was humbled out of that sentiment when I started talking to people from different fields who think about marriage as an institution and monogamy as an ideal and as a kind of biological imperative or non-imperative. And I realized that, if you talk to a lawyer, or you talk to an anthropologist, or you talk to a psychologist, or you talk to a sex therapist, or you talk to a couples marriage counselor, or you talk to almost any angle you attack this from, you could make a PhD dissertation about that. So
Yes.
It's a very serious subject, and it affects us all. Whether even if you decide to go live up in a mountain by yourself as a hermit, you still had parents who made some choices regarding this central aspect of our lives of like, how do we pair up, and how do we make families, and how do we respond to the biological and cultural impulses of sex? And so that's how the movie was born, as a way to find out what happened, why had I gotten married to begin with, why does marriage exist as an institution, and why does monogamy exist as an ideal, and is it the only way? So because also I was, like at least half of Americans, I was the child of a broken up parents. Actually, my parents never even got married, but they split up when I was 8 years old, and I remember that being very painful for me and for them. And so I was wondering, how it also affects children growing up, even though I don't have children yet.
And how did you feel it affected you?
How did what affect me? Making the movie? Or?
The fact that your parents split up.
Oh, I mean, I'm a very optimistic person, and so I quickly, became grateful for the opportunity to have two lives. Like my father was in Italy, and I would spend the summers with him, and in a very kind of unique environment, because my father was an Italian prince, and we had a castle outside of Rome that's been in our family since 1531.
Wow.
And so I'd spend the summers with my father was very extravagant, very larger than life figure. He was famous playboy in the 50s and 60s, hung out with people like Salvador Dali and Brigitte Bardot. I mean, my older brother's godparents are Salvador Dali and Brigitte Bardot.
Wow.
Although they didn't the priest wouldn't let Brigitte Bardot into the church because she was so scandalous. So they, at the time, in 1967. So I had this on the one hand, this very unusual life and background with this, eccentric Italian aristocrat father. And then on the other hand, my mother, who's a wonderful artist who grew up in the United States, she gave us a very kind of normal middle class upbringing in Los Angeles and New York a little bit. So I got to have these two lives, and I'm still grateful for that opportunity and the idea of not having just one set of, I think there's advantages. Just like I found in making the film, there's advantages to monogamy and there's advantages to non-monogamy, and we should have an honest conversation about that.
I totally agree with you, and I think when we look at anything in our lives, if we can look at it exactly that way, as sort of a blessing, that you appreciate the different, lives you had with each parent, that enriches us. But so many other people may, it depends on how somebody focuses on a divorce and of their parents, and it can bring up all kinds of negative things. But if you can look at, no matter what, even if to go back to even being married, you were married for 10 years. I think some people are just in our lives for certain periods of time.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily always going to be there forever. And not to say that can't happen, and I still believe that can happen. But if a marriage ends, then that's the time that you were supposed to spend with that person. And if you can look at it and appreciate the part that person played in your life, and be grateful for it and for the lessons you've learned, because it's always about learning. If you don't do that and you're in the negative space and you're angry and disappointed, and you never grow. And
this also shows, like, to me, the flexibility in the culture to redefining these things, because even the word monogamous used to mean one partner for your entire life, and people who were divorced were seen as almost second class, or they were definitely frowned on by the morally righteous, right? Mm-hmm. Now even the most conservative people kind of accept that people, might have one marriage and then another and then another. You see this amongst the most conservative Republicans. In our, they don't seem to see anything wrong with espousing traditional values and also having had 3 marriages. So, what counts as monogamous changes over time, and that was one of the things I discovered making this film. Was that, every age and every culture thinks that their way of doing it is the natural way, the only way. And we enter into our relationships very unconsciously. We just kind of default into certain patterns and kind of hand over the keys to our, bodily autonomy, let's say, and are just take for granted that this is the way it's meant to be. And all you have to do is look 20 years back, 50 years back, 100 years back, or look at other cultures and look at one of the most fascinating interview subjects of the film is Christopher Ryan, who wrote a New York Times bestseller called Sex at Dawn, which speculates in a very interesting and educated way about sexual practices of pre-agricultural societies, or prehistoric societies. And what he found was that the imposition of monogamy mostly towards women, because men pretty much have done what they wanted, and
Yes.
for most of history. But the imposition of monogamy on women coincided with the advent of agriculture and private property. Because if you look at tribes that don't have private property, like that still even are around today, like so-called primitive tribes, and they can be in very faraway places, whether it's South America or Indonesia, so they have like nothing to do with each other. Some of these tribes share ideas like partible paternity, which means that a child can have more than one father, and therefore when a woman is pregnant, she should have sex with, she wants a kid who's funny and smart and good hunter, then she should have sex with the funny guy and the good hunter guy, and and so that each of these attributes goes into the child's, and then each of these men is responsible for the child, and nobody's thinking like, oh no, she shouldn't have sex with this guy because she's mine, and that. We can talk about that.
Yeah,
more later
I loved that in the movie. I thought that was really fascinating, actually. This movie, I want to encourage our listeners out there to get this movie. Go see this movie. We're going to talk about where you can see it and whatnot. But Monogamish it's a really wonderful documentary, and everyone that I've talked to who have seen it so far has just thought it was a fascinating documentary. But it spurred a lot of conversation afterwards, many more conversations. I was looking so forward to talking with you today after seeing the movie. But we're going to be right back after these brief messages. You are listening to The Jan Price Show, all about movies on Power Talk 1460 and 101 FM, and like The Jan Price Show on Facebook.
Have you ever dreamed of doing commercials or movies? Your dream starts with a desire. And if you have the desire to do commercials and feature films, we want to know about you. We're Moco Film, one of the Genesis companies that includes VoiceJock, a major provider of TV commercial talent to TV stations throughout the nation. Registering is free. Just go to mocofilm.com and fill out the information. That's MOCOfilm.com. You'll become part of a large talent bank available to producers. Go to mocofilm.com today and start living your dream.
Tired of looking at your worn wood floors? Mr. Sandless can bring them back to life again. That's right, it's Mr. Sandless, the no-sanding solution to beautiful wood floors. Mr. Sandless is clean, efficient, contains no harmful chemicals, and is certified green. Mr. Sandless refinishes all hardwoods, softwoods, engineered flooring, and laminates. Most jobs are completed in one day with no cleanup required ever, with virtually no odor, and is safe for pets and kids. No need to move out or even leave the house. Mr. Sandless is the company that invented Sandless Refinishing and is the largest floor refinishing company in the world. Over 120,000 happy customers, guaranteed adhesion, guaranteed satisfaction, and a 5-year warranty. Call Mr. Sandless today at 831-747-7476. That's 747-7476. Or MrSandless.com. That's MrSandless.com.
On Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1, streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
We are back, and my guest today is Tao Ruspoli, and we're talking about his new movie called Monogamish. When you started this movie, it started off being something completely different, and you talked about this recently, that your mother saw it and said, no, that wasn't the way you should go. Talk a little bit about that. I thought that was funny.
Well, as I said earlier, that this is a topic that touches us all very deeply, right? I mean, we're all affected by these choices. There's nobody in the world who doesn't have to take a stance on monogamy and the way we choose to couple up, pair up, raise families, create these little economic, emotional units that we call the nuclear family, which is constantly transformed throughout our history and is influenced by the church and is influenced by government, is influenced by all sorts of things. And so there was the temptation to keep the topic at arm's length. It's very easy to make an academic film about this.
Right.
And therefore not take any risks, because you can take refuge in intellectualism, which is what early cuts of the film did. And I thought I was done after about a year of doing it. I showed it to my mother, who's supposed to be your most, kind critic. And at the end of it, I said, "Hey, so what do you think?" And I saw this like very serious look on her face, and she said, "It's a disaster."
Oh, no, Mom.
And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you can't take a film about the heart and make it only by, with your head. You have to have emotional stakes. It has to matter. You have to put your heart in it. You have to show us why this matters to you." And so there I had to kind of take a hard look in the mirror, and I started by saying, "Okay, Mom, well, let's talk to you then first. Let me, if you're telling me this, then you've got to put something in this as well. And so let's have an honest conversation." And there used to be in the 1960s a kind of ideal of cinema verite, which was like the idea that, the camera should just be a fly on the wall. The filmmakers should disappear and just catch life unaware. And I think that was a misguided notion because, first of all, it's impossible. The camera, everyone's always aware of a camera. And instead of resisting the fact that the camera is there or pretending it's not there, I think we can use the camera as a way of opening up a space for truth that doesn't come out otherwise. Just like if me and you were sitting in our, having coffee right now without these microphones and everything here, maybe we wouldn't go as deep into this conversation. So turning the camera onto my mother and saying, "Let's talk about your relationship with my father. Let's talk about you splitting up and what it was like to be a 17-year-old girl with a nearly 50-year-old man, having a child." Amazing. And then leaving him when she was 25 with 2 children and moving to LA and trying to raise 2 kids on her own. And what is that like? And this is not things that often a son can just ask his mother to really look at the causes and consequences of their choices and things that have been imposed on them by her parents too. And the parents, I'm very lucky that I have a family tree that goes back 1,200 years.
Amazing.
In a straight line to my father. So I got to go back to Italy and interview my cousin who lives in the Ruspoli Castle, which is, like I said, it's been in our family since 1531, and look at how marriage was and how couplings were organized, often without any consent, even by the women who were involved. And all of this shapes, who we are. And yeah, it was just an amazing opportunity to use the camera and the filmmaking process as a way to explore a universal issue, but also a very personal one. And I think that in the end, after 5 more years of working on it, after thinking I was done at the first time, I succeeded from what I've seen in the wonderful audience reactions we've had at all the screenings that we've been doing. That I've succeeded humbly in sparking a real conversation. As you said, that the question and answer is often as interesting as watching the movie.
Yes.
And also just eliciting a thoughtful and emotional and humorous response. Also, I've got to say, the movie doesn't take itself too seriously. I think that's one of the things that works really well, largely thanks to some of the wonderful characters in the movie. My cousin in Italy is a very, very funny woman and has the audience in stitches for a lot of the time, even though she's talking about very serious things. And also Roberta Hayes, my 75-year-old neighbor, who's just incredibly funny and frank. And I asked her at some point in the film, do you think men are less monogamous than women? And she says, "Yes, absolutely. Men biologically, but judging that way, I must be a man too." So that was another really interesting discovery in making this movie. Is it's now kind of recognized that women actually seek novelty as much as men do. Women tire of monogamy even faster than men do. And are worse at faking it even, But the problem is the culture has has so repressed women's sexuality, and so much of the laws throughout the centuries have been a response, men's response to their fear of women's desire and expressing their sexual nature. That it's been all about repressing that, and so now as we enter into an era, hopefully, of more and more equality between men and women, you're going to see women expressing their sexual natures much more than they used to, and men are going to have to come to terms with that.
Well, that is the root of women's power. Is their sexuality, and I think
also
that's why
the root of the repression. Yeah,
and that's what I mean. That's why it's been repressed, because of the fear of that. If you know, and we'll go back centuries, women were very powerful, much more so than we are today too. But not, we've taken a long time. We went backwards for a while, and coming back forth to more our power again. But one of the things I found interesting was one of your ancestors. I couldn't. When she got tired of her husband, she would just have him murdered.
Yeah,
she couldn't get divorced. And I thought, I think modern day women might like that again. No, I'm just teasing.
One of them she killed with her own hands.
Really?
The woman who brought the castle into our family in 1531, she was the niece of the Pope, and therefore she was very powerful. It was arranged that she would marry this man, and the Pope gave them the Ruspoli Castle as a wedding present. And soon after, she killed him in the fireplace. And Claudia, my cousin, says very humorously, like, we didn't have to deal with lawyers back then who just make you, just sit around sucking your blood slowly and nothing ever happens. Just a light bang on the head or a light little poison and ciao, she says. Much easier. My father used to call her the first feminist.
That was so wonderful. Well, I love your cousin and her stories, and and going to the castle was just fabulous. Fascinating to see, and to see your family tree. Physically see this family tree too. How did you attract because you interview a lot of different people in this movie. How did you attract the different people, and how did you choose them?
Well, I had a wonderful researcher that, I just started reading all these books. Again, there was a guy named Eric Berkowitz who wrote a book called, he was a historian of the law and would write, try and make legal histories accessible to the general public. And people used to ask him, what was the first law? And he became curious about that. So he started looking at early Mesopotamian law. And he found that all the first laws were about sex. And the first instance of capital punishment that he could find on earth was the impalement of a woman for cheating on her husband. So,
wow.
Yeah, so he was going to write a book on the history of the law, and how boring does that sound? But he then decided that he could write a book of the history of sex and the law, and that would be much more titillating and interesting. And he did that, and I read it, and it's fantastic. And I got to interview him, and each book and interview would lead me to somebody else. And the documentary filmmaking process is very much a learning process for the filmmaker as well. And that was just I felt like I went to school for a few years about this,
Oh, well, you feel that too. I mean, even watching the movie, you feel like, wow, what an education you got when you were filming this. And we're only seeing pieces of it. So I can only imagine, because obviously there's a lot of things that ended up on the cutting room floor, but I can only imagine what it was like for you to experience it, learning all of these things and talking to all these fascinating people. Really,
it's a great way, if there are filmmakers out there and they really want to learn about a subject, go make a movie about it, whatever you think people ask me, what's your conclusion about monogamy after finishing the movie? And I say, as complicated as I thought it was, it's actually much more complicated than that. It's a very deep subject, and all we can hope for, and what I'd like to do with the film, is give people the tools to have a more thoughtful and nuanced conversation. There are no easy answers to this, and if there had been, if there were, somebody would have thought of them before me, and we'd all just be doing that thing. But all we can do is have an honest conversation with each other about what our needs are. And I think that the great conclusion of the film is that there are a million different ways that we can configure our relationships, and that the sooner we are able to acknowledge that, and that our needs might not be the same as everybody else's, we can then have conversations with the people that we pair up with, and hopefully find somebody with whom we're compatible. Because there's a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of people who have very, very different boundaries. I was shocked when I heard, a woman looked very conservative that I talked to, and she said, "Yeah, my husband has had lovers our whole 40 years of marriage, and I'm very grateful to these women for giving him something that I wasn't able to give him anymore."
Wow.
And not feeling the pressure of having to give him that anymore. And I've had friendships with those women and known very well what was going on.
Yeah.
And I was like floored, because she was a very conservative woman with a very traditional family. So you see that, and then you see we did a lot of man on the street interviews, and there's a wonderfully humorous moment of this very young couple. They must be 18 years old or 20 or something, and she says, I ask her, "Well, what about porn?" And she says, "Oh, I would never, under any circumstances, understand why he would want to look at porn or need to look at porn." And she can't see him because he's standing next to her, and he's scratching his neck in the most uncomfortable way, and he's looking shifty and everything, and she's just going on in her idealistic way, like, of course he doesn't need to look at it. And it's just like the whole audience is laughing because it's so obvious that there's a disconnect between her ideal and the reality, right?
Yes.
And so I think that was one of the main things we're exploring in the movie as well, is like, where is there there's a chasm between the ideal of the monogamous lifelong, they walk into the sunset life, happily ever after, and the reality of the mess that everybody's living through. So if we can bridge that gap a little bit with the help of this film and with the help of thoughtful, honest conversations between people, then maybe we might live happier relationships.
I think you're right. And we'll be right back after these brief messages. You're listening to The Jan Price Show, all about movies on Power Talk 1460 and 101 FM, and like The Jan Price Show on Facebook.
Do you have difficulty falling or staying asleep? Do you suffer from snoring, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, or other sleep disorders? If so, we can help. Call Monterey Bay Sleep Center and arrange a sleep study in one of our luxury suites. We specialize in diagnosing and treating sleep disorders so you can regain your quality of life. Our luxury suites feature hotel-quality beds and flat panel TVs so that you feel most comfortable during your stay. Call us today to arrange a sleep study at our secure facility in Monterey.
Call 831-920-1411. That's 831-920-1411.
The Ozio Theater in downtown Monterey is now open every day, showing independent and foreign films. The Ozio Theater has new concession offerings, including beer, wine, hard cider, and their homemade Lush Slush. You can now schedule private event screenings for community charity events, birthdays, anniversaries, or just a fun gathering of friends. For more information, visit the Ozio Theater online at oziotheater.com.
On Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1. Streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
We are back, and my guest today is Tao Ruspoli, and we're talking about his new movie called Monogamish, and it's a fascinating conversation we're having about love, marriage, sex, and monogamy. So one of the things, did you get to see the movie Professor Marsden and the Wonder Women?
No, not yet.
Okay. Well, it is about the polyamorous relationship that Professor Marsden, who created the Wonder Woman comic book, for those who do not know, and they started a polyamorous relationship in the 1920s.
Oh, wow.
And Wonder Woman is based on these two Wonder Women in his life, his wife and his mistress, who they invited in. It's fascinating movie. I loved it. It didn't stick around very long, and I don't think it's doing too well, unfortunately. But it's all about this topic. And then we go, well, we think it's all new thinking, when we look at things. And I'm sure you discovered this too, that, we think this is all modern and this is just progressive thinking for today. Well, the reality is when we look at history of sex, it's been going on for centuries and centuries.
But it is always new, I think. Like, I also think you have to you don't want to make the mistake of equating what it's like today than it was 100 years ago.
No, I don't mean that. I mean, but, just that this kind of thing was going on. It's been going on. What I mean is we think it's never been going on before. And when you realize it has been going on, it's not new, these two things. But
and of course, you've used the word, polyamory. We should explain.
Right, let's explain that. And also because it's a big part of your movie. And I think that's a real important discussion. So polyamorous, go ahead and...
Yeah, so that's a relatively new word. Poly meaning many, amorous. It mixes Greek and Latin, which is a kind of a no-no. But other than that, it's a nice word. Many loves. It should be multi-amorous or polyphiliac, right? So the idea, of people who are challenging the norms of monogamy, there's people who do it in different ways. Some people say, okay, well, we can have sex outside of the relationship as long as it doesn't have any emotional attachment. And that's like something that's been going on a long time in like swinging communities, right?
Right.
And people associate that with often with conservative suburban families who have this little release of like sexual adventurism, but that still keeps the nuclear family model completely intact. And then there's this other idea, which is kind of growing rapidly, and especially on the East and West coasts, maybe the nuclear family model is not the only way to go, and maybe we can actually have multiple loving relationships at the same time. Maybe 3 people can be together in a family or romantic unit or triad, as it's called. And then there's just been multiple conversations about what people are okay with, and what people have found is that yes, there's a lot of people who are okay with more than they thought they were okay with, and I discovered this in the movie, meeting people who were married in traditional monogamous relationships, realizing that they weren't having sex anymore, and what are we going to do about it? Often what happens in the traditional model is one person has an affair, the other person finds out eventually, much heartbreak and drama ensues, followed by divorce lawyers and ripping apart of families, and it's definitely not an ideal situation.
No.
Except for the lawyers, maybe. Like
right.
they get to do really well in this. But as far as the children, as far as everybody else involved, it's the most traumatic experience that you can go through, besides death, maybe. And so people have started to say, well, maybe we can just talk about this fact that maybe our relationship has grown past its sexual time. Everybody's familiar with the fact that after many years with somebody, sex might not be a priority between the two people anymore, but yet the people still don't want to give up on that part of themselves, and that's why they have affairs. And then some people have said, well, maybe we can just be okay with that, and maybe we can realize that when our partner is satisfied sexually, it makes them a happier, nicer person, and maybe it can even new friendships can emerge in very unexpected ways when 2 people, instead of competing over the love and attention of one person, actually acknowledge that love is not a zero-sum game, and just like if you have 2 children doesn't mean you love each one half as much. Maybe if you have 2 lovers, you can love them both equally, and it doesn't mean it takes away one from the other. And again, this is an idealized picture of it, because obviously human emotions are a mess and complicated, and so I don't want to sugarcoat it. But there have been more and more recently, I think, successful attempts at questioning the traditional picture or narrative of infidelity and of multiple sexual relationships, which we obviously all, to some degree or other, crave, I think.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what fantasy world's about, too, what people fantasize. One of the things I loved, again, to go back to Professor Marsden and the Wonder Women, is that they all lived together. And each of them had 2 children by Professor Marsden. Then when he died in 1947, they stayed together until they both died.
The 2 women did.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And there's one of their sons is, has chronicled all of this. But
there's a great story in the movie also in Monogamish about a guy who, has these 2 beautiful girlfriends, and he's really on his high horse thinking, not only do I have these wonderful erotic relationships with 2 beautiful women, but if one of them left, I'd still have the other one. So he's like in the back of his mind in this Machiavellian way thinking this, never once occurring to him that they both could leave him at the same time and stay together, which is what ended up happening.
Exactly.
So
and he was like, what happened?
So, and we joke about in the film, like, is being left by 2 women twice as painful as being left by one? And he says, yeah, maybe it is, So, again, there's a lot of things you don't expect when you enter this world of polyamory. Oftentimes, I've now kind of entered into it myself, and there is this kind of fantasy of like the man with 2 women, and oftentimes what that situation creates is more camaraderie and solidarity between the women, and the man can often end up feeling left out. And often you have a picture of this man with 2 women thinking that it's like the traditional kind of macho thing of like some powerful male with like, subservient women. But today it's not like that. There's a lawyer in the film called Diana Adams who's like advocates for non-traditional family arrangements. And she has a male lover and a female lover. And she's very much the boss in that family. And so while from afar it might look like a guy with 2 women, it's actually a woman with a man and a woman. and it's a very matriarchal arrangement. So I think there's room now for women who are very powerful and motivated and economically self-sufficient to flip the model that we're used to of the male breadwinner. And she talks about in the film that there's been the government has really tried hard to encourage traditional family because it privatizes any sort of dependence. Basically, if you have a single mother trying to raise children and in a workforce that's still very male dominated, then how do you deal with the fact that she doesn't have enough money? Well, you encourage her to get married to a man who can help support her, which she says, I think provocatively but correctly, is the government being a pimp to poor women and single mothers in America.
I totally agree with that too. How that, when that came out, I was like, yeah, that, you don't even think about it in that way, but that's the truth. So we're going to be right back after these brief messages. You're listening to the Jan Price Show, all about movies on Power Talk 1460 and 101 FM, and like the Jan Price Show on Facebook.
Tired of looking at your worn wood floors? Mr. Sandless can bring them back to life again. That's right, it's Mr. Sandless, the no sanding solution to beautiful wood floors. Mr. Sandless is clean, efficient, contains no harmful chemicals, and is certified green. Mr. Sandless refinishes all hardwoods, softwoods, engineered flooring, and laminates. Most jobs are completed in one day with no cleanup required ever, with virtually no odor, and is safe for pets and kids. No need to move out or even leave the house. Mr. Sandless is the company that invented Sandless Refinishing and is the largest floor refinishing company in the world. Over 120,000 happy customers, guaranteed adhesion, guaranteed satisfaction, and a 5-year warranty. Call Mr. Sandless today at 831-747-7476. That's 747-7476. Or MrSandless.com. That's MrSandless.com.
Have you ever dreamed of doing commercials or movies? Your dream starts with a desire. And if you have the desire to do commercials and feature films, we want to know about you. We're Moco Film, one of the Genesis companies that includes VoiceJock, a major provider of TV commercial talent to TV stations throughout the nation. Registering is free. Just go to mocofilm.com and fill out the information. That's MOCOfilm.com. You'll become part of a large talent bank available to producers. Go to mocofilm.com today and start living your dream.
on Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1. Streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
We are back, and my guest today is Tao Ruspoli, and we're having a fascinating discussion about marriage, sex, and monogamy, and his new movie called Monogamish. And before we went to the commercial break, we were talking about polyamorous relationships. But I want to touch just briefly on, Mormons have had polygamy for a long, long time, and they call I lived in Utah for 7 years, and they call each other sister wives. Now, there's the extremist groups that I certainly don't go with having sex with young children and forcing it on them. But there's these other groups that are very much like we're talking about, polyamorous, who have, another wife necessarily there. And my mother used to say she thought it was a fabulous idea. And my mother was, pretty progressive in her own way, that she thought it'd be good to have two women there to take care of things. I
just think I'm wary of like the polygamy within the context of such a patriarchal religion. I had a friend who recently left the Mormon church because she was at Brigham Young University, and she had to take a multiple choice test, and the question was, what is the greatest contributor to like the decline of Western civilization? And the correct answer was the women's liberation movement.
Oh, wow.
And that's when she got up and like just walked out of school and decided that she couldn't be a part of this anymore.
Good for her, because I have to tell you, Mormon women are pretty strong women.
Well, of course, within women in general are strong creatures, and but if it's within the confines of this very traditional in quotes, because I don't think it's just it's very historically contingent, I think. But this kind of male-dominated model of the family, or you also have in the Muslim world, like the Sultan with his many wives, and I just don't want to. People often bring up the Mormon parallel, but I think that within a context of women's empowerment and true consent and choice, there's really very little that the two models have in common.
Right. As I said, there's other factions that aren't considered part of the Mormon church that are more like we're just talking about, more polyamorous, and that sort of, except they're not the fundamentalists, and they don't even consider themselves Mormon, but because they came from that environment, many of them, they practice that.
There's a more egalitarian openness amongst the Maasai in Africa. They have a situation where men have many wives, but the women are allowed to sleep with any other man as well, as long as he's within 5-year age range of the husband.
5 years? Why is that?
Because they have a class system built on age. And so that the woman has to sleep with only men of the same class as her husband. Otherwise, it, I guess, would cause too much competition or difficulty between that. So that was very interesting, because there was a BBC reporter when I was doing research who goes and is talking to this handsome Maasai warrior and says, I would love to be your wife. She kind of says flirtatiously, but I would want to be the only one, which is a typical, Western thing for a woman to think or say, or a man too. I want to be the only one. That we have that whole romance about that. And he looks at her and just a little confused, saying, that sounds like so much work and so lonely. Just, you want to do everything by yourself? Like raise the children and keep the house and do all of the things that the wife does? Like, that sounds miserable to him. And it just didn't occur to him why she would want to be alone in this. Mm-hmm. So again, we take things for granted that, like, of course you want to be the only one because that somehow validates you. But I think once you step out of that paradigm, you see that there's a whole lot of other interesting kind of solidarity and camaraderie that can happen between people in unexpected ways.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. You had an older couple that had married, 50 years? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a great balance. And, had, other happy couples too. But tell us a little bit about that couple and how did you find them and their relationship?
I was talking to Christopher Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn, and he has become kind of a guru of the open relationship model, because he's like, we have a kind of folk Darwinian tale about like, oh, man just wants to go spread his seed and woman wants to stay at home and be monogamous, and and it's couched in kind of a scientific narrative, and he kind of smashes that pretty effectively, I think, saying that that's actually much more couched in ideology, and hidden ideology than we realize. And if you look at the evidence, actually, like as we've talked about, women want to seek novelty as much as men do, and everything we've already talked about. So anyway, he then says something about like, if marriage and monogamy are for you, and that's wonderful, and if it works for you. And he says, for example, my parents, they've been married 50 years and happy and monogamous. And he says, and mom and dad, if you're listening, I don't want to know about it if you weren't. And so I said to him after the interview, like, well, do you mind if I go talk to your parents? Because this would be really interesting. And sure enough, there they were, like a beautiful couple who just fit the very traditional model of, and of course, this probably helped shape him, and his ability to stray from it possibly was made possible by the nurturing stability that he got from his parents. So again, these issues are so complex. Like, and then on the other hand, you have like my uncle, who I talked to in the movie, whose father, who was my grandfather, had 3 children with 3 different women at the same time, and he resisted by going the other way and being married to the same woman for 15 years and staying with her because he craved a stability that he never had. So there's Esther Perel, who wrote Mating in Captivity. She's a wonderful writer and therapist, and she's in the movie. And she gets at the heart of it by saying, we have 2 conflicting interests in our lives and desires, and you see it already in children and small children. On the one hand, they want the safety and security of their parents, and they hold their parents' hands and like want to make sure that that's there. And on the other hand, they want to explore, and there's this push-pull of like leaving the parents to see what's out there, and then running back to make sure that there's the safety of the home, and so that carries over into our romantic relationships. We want one person to provide 2 opposite things. We want safety and security and predictability and stability, and then we also want eroticism and the unknown and danger, and we put all this weight on one relationship that if it doesn't give you both those opposite things, then it's somehow failing. And she says a wonderful thing, which is this is not a problem that we'll ever resolve. It's just a paradox that we manage.
Wow. I think if it's when we look at relationships, we're looking for that person, and I hated this when I saw it in Jerry Maguire, you complete me. I think, people are still looking for someone to complete them. And to me, you have to be a whole, complete person in order to come to a relationship. I think you have to, and this is a hard thing for many people to it's a lifelong process of truly loving who you are, yourself first, and taking care of yourself and knowing what your own boundaries are and what it is you truly want and don't want in the relationship. And as you talk about, keeping an open dialogue going, because like anything in life, it's always changing and evolving. It's like, do we stay with the same job for 50 years, or 30 years anymore? Not in today's world. It's rare.
Even if you do, it's constantly changing.
Yes.
Even the couples I talk to who have been together and stay together monogamously, their relationship is different when it's 5 days, 5 months, 5 years, 50 years in, like, and the idea that it's always going to stay the same. I mean, that would be horrible, right?
It would be boring, totally boring. Well, yeah, you're going through the childbirth years and raising your children and maybe having 2 careers as you're doing that, and then you go through the empty nest and and then grandchildren and what's left the rest of your life. And if you find that person that you're compatible with, that you can have that lifelong relationship, I'm always happy. I love being around happy people. Yeah. Lately, it seems like everybody I know is falling in love and getting into relationship. I don't know if it has anything to do with what's going on in the world, but there's more coupling going on lately, I have found, which I find interesting too, just to see that.
There is safety and solace we find in having a partner. Like there's no question that what I find interesting is that if you look at the 1960s, there was the 50s had been so repressive and so defined by the boundaries that the people who broke out of that thought that there was nothing worth keeping. And if you look at like people, even with like, Timothy Leary in like 1965 advocating for like LSD and free love. And it's shocking if you listen to the lectures back then that he would give saying everyone should drop out of school. Everyone should quit their jobs. No one over 40 should be allowed to vote. Everyone should move into like, back to nature. And that was just like, it was throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
Now we have this, having been through that and having rejected the things completely, I think people are recognizing, no, actually we can acknowledge that we do like a certain amount of safety and predictability, and we do like to pair up with people, and we do like some of the things that come with that. And oftentimes people who are advocating for opening up the strict view of monogamy, it's actually to preserve commitment. And Dan Savage talks about this in the film. He says, he and his partner have been together 20 years and they've raised a child, and yet because they're open, he gets letters every day saying, you don't really love each other because you're open sexually. And he will write back saying, well, how many relationships have you had in the last 20 years? And they'll say, well, I've had 4 monogamous relationships. And he says, yeah, each of these people you've discarded for novelty and for newness. And now for some reason you love your partner more than I love mine, right? So there's a recognition today in these movements, towards different types of relationships that we do want to preserve some continuity and some sense of being loved and appreciated and growing with somebody. But maybe that doesn't have to come with a strict sexual exclusivity.
Exactly. I call it serial monogamy.
Yeah.
The people having they have one relationship after another, but they're monogamous. But they can go from one to the next to the next to the next. Yeah. You are listening to the Jan Price Show, all about movies on Power Talk 1460 and 101 FM, and like the Jan Price Show on Facebook.
Do you have difficulty falling or staying asleep? Do you suffer from snoring, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, or other sleep disorders? If so, we can help. Call Monterey Bay Sleep Center and arrange a sleep study in one of our luxury suites. We specialize in diagnosing and treating sleep disorders so you can regain your quality of life. Our luxury suites feature hotel-quality beds and flat panel TVs so that you feel most comfortable during your stay. Call us today to arrange a sleep study at our secure facility in Monterey.
Call 831-920-1411. That's 831-920-1411.
The Ozio Theater in downtown Monterey is now open every day, showing independent and foreign films. The Ozio Theater has new concession offerings, including beer, wine, hard cider, and their homemade Lush Slush. You can now schedule private event screenings for community charity events, birthdays, anniversaries, or just a fun gathering of friends. For more information, visit the Ozio Theater online at oziotheater.com.
On Power Talk AM 1460 and FM 101.1, streaming worldwide on iHeartRadio. Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show.
We are back, and my guest today is Tao Ruspoli, and we're talking about his new movie called Monogamish. And I could probably talk to you for hours and hours, but I think we need to let people know where they can see Monogamish, where it's playing, and
so yeah, we've been playing around the country. It's now making a documentary is almost like writing a book. You go on a book tour. I've gotten to screen the film all over the country, and the audience reactions have been amazing. Like usually, if you do, I've made other films, and obviously I've been to a lot of film festivals where you have a Q&A after the movie.
Yes.
And usually half the audience gets up and doesn't stick around for the Q&A. I've never seen a movie where just everybody just sits frozen in their seats and just can't wait to get into a conversation about it, because this movie, again, it's about starting a conversation more than about prescribing any sort of answers. And so if you go to monogamishmovie.com, MONOGAMISH, monogamishmovie.com, you can see screenings, and you can see also, we sold the movie to Stars, so it'll be on the pay-per-view, and also it will be on iTunes and hopefully Netflix and all of the media online. And also we have a Facebook page where you can see upcoming screenings and other information about the film, and also engage in dialogue about it on Facebook, and that's facebook.com/monogamishmovie.
Wonderful, wonderful. Oh, it's a wonderful movie. I highly recommend everybody search it out, find it. We'll post that on my Facebook page too, and we'll get the word out. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show. And as I said, we can sit and talk for hours and hours. And when we saw, I was at one of your screenings, and you're right, the audience stayed. The questions afterwards were fascinating. I'm sure you stayed hours talking to everybody. Nobody wanted to leave. No.
Like I said, this topic affects everybody. There's no one who's not touched by the way that we choose and the way the culture kind of imposes a certain expectations of what it's like to pair up with each other or triple up with each other these days, or quadruple up.
Whatever. Thank you, Tao. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure. You've been listening to the Jan Price Show, all about movies on Power Talk 1460 and 101 FM, and like the Jan Price Show on Facebook.